Midnight Gospel is one of those animations where you don't know what to expect, but when you watch it, you discover it's something exceedingly special that only comes once in a lifetime. I remember seeing the trailer when it came out 5 years ago in 2020 and being so excited to watch this trippy looking show. And when I found out it was a mature sort of animation, I was even more intrigued. As you know, the world of adult animation is quite harsh, with so many good shows getting cancelled before they even get a chance to build their audience. Shows like Close Enough, Inside Job, and Tuka and Birdie, just to name a few examples. Don't worry, I'ma get my lick back. Midnight Gospel has suddenly joined their ranks as Duncan Trussell, who's the main voice for Clancy in the show, announced on his Twitter that the show had been cancelled. And because Netflix owns the right to the IP, he can't even continue the story anywhere else. Although he expressed gratitude for the chance to make the show in the first place, I can't help but think about how unfair it is. There's something to be said about the way companies can just hoard intellectual property like dragons hoard treasure, but that's a discussion for another day. For now, I want to discuss the Midnight Gospel and what I've come to appreciate about it during its brief run. The Midnight Gospel is an adult animation that released April 20th, 2020. Save your 420 jokes. It was created by podcaster and comedian Duncan Trussell and Pendleton Ward, who some of you might know as the creator of Adventure Time and distant relative of Abraham Lincoln. Come to think of it, they are pretty similar in animation style, humor, and other things. It follows the exploits of Clancy Gilroy, a spacecaster, and his unlicensed multiverse simulator, as he journeys through different worlds to collect interviews and post on his spacecasting channel. The show and its many guests cover a wide range of topics from death to magic, Buddhism, mindfulness, and much more. It gets really existential, and I love that about it. What I find very interesting about the show is how it's basically a creative adaptation of a non-fiction podcast, that being the Duncan Trussell Family Hour podcast. Usually, when you think of adaptations, the first thing that comes to mind would be book to movie or video game to movie, usually with varying degrees of success. So when Clancy goes to all these different worlds to interview people, he's actually talking to the guests of his own podcast on his own show. And that's actually cool because while Midnight Gospel is a solid show, it's basically free promotion for the podcast. After the show, I've definitely gone to look for the podcast my favorite episode came from. You should check it out on whatever platform you get your podcast. I use Spotify personally, so I'll put the link in the description for anyone who's curious. As I said before, the world of Midnight Gospel is set in the dimension of the chromatic ribbon. I guess because of all the colorful, albeit deadly warbles that line Clancy's property. It's really just an overall fascinating concept. The multiverse simulator is a device that allows the main character to travel to other worlds, most of which are dying. I read that it's apparently because Clancy doesn't take care of his simulator at all, and we see that throughout the show he's pretty careless. He doesn't read the FAQ, doesn't oil his machine, and doesn't take care with what he brings back from other universes. It's clear he uses the multiverse simulator as a way to escape his real life, as shown by the strained relationship with his sister, who lent him the money to buy the simulator in the first place. My main character is described as a slacker by the creators of the show, and boy does it show. You can also see when the voice acting shifts from being Clancy to being Duncan. Where Clancy is quite childish, Duncan speaks with bountiful patience, and I think that's cool. There are other characters in the show besides Clancy, like the evil neighbor, ice cream guy, and his dad, but I don't know much about them since the show did not continue. Before we move on to the meat of the video, I just want to talk a little bit about the production, because if you're anything like me, you're probably curious about how this came about. Pendleton said he always wanted to make something meaningful. Adventure Time was a wacky show with some surrealistic elements that sometimes alluded to philosophical topics, but it couldn't really expand on those ideas because it was a kid show with an 11-minute runtime per episode. Midnight Gospel was born when Pendleton Ward discovered the Duncan Trussell Family Hour podcast and immediately fell in love with the host's interviewing style. When he came upon the podcast, he realized Duncan was doing the cool stuff he wanted to do. A friend of mine told me about the podcast when we were working on Adventure Time. I was interested because I like listening to people talk about philosophy, and Duncan is really funny. Duncan interviews a lot of people who are kind, who practice kindness, and listening to them guides me, and I like to think about these things. Looking death in the eye helps me live my life. Duncan's podcasts are a beautiful art form, and I wanted to draw on them, create juicy, spicy visuals so that people can see something while listening to these great conversations. I know that was a long quote, but I read it all out to illustrate the immense amount of respect Pendleton has for Duncan and his podcast. I'm also heavily inclined to agree because when you listen to the show's interviews, you feel how easy the conversation flows. And it doesn't matter what they're talking about, it just flows and it's digestible, and no matter your experience, you can take something from it. For example, in episode 2 with Annie Lamotte, where I left with the excellent quote, "Through love, all pain is medicine." And this was after she talked about how depression often lies to artists and creators, telling us we needed to be funny or that our art is not as meaningful without that crushing sadness. While it won't speak to everyone's experience as a creator, it certainly spoke to mine. On Duncan's end, things started when he received an email from Pendleton telling him how much he enjoyed the podcast. The two of them soon became friends, and eventually Pendleton pitched him the idea for an animated adaptation of his show. And so, after Pendleton stepped down as the showrunner for Adventure Time, he drafted a concept of what would be the first episode, the president shooting the zombies. I guess this really got Duncan on board because years later, the Midnight Gospel was released. Pendleton talked about how he would basically have to listen through the old podcast, then cut it down to a 20-minute segment before recording new sections, which they would have to invite previous guests to reprise their roles. This is what made for the seamless transitions in the show between the podcast segments. Soon after the early concepts were finalized, they enlisted the help of several writers for their writer's room, the talents of Johnny Pemberton, Weird Al Yankovic, Maja Jo Oost, and more, as well as help from the animation studio Titmouse, supervised by Mike Mayfield, who allowed for free interpretation of the show's visual language. This freedom allowed them to create the dreamy, psychedelic feel the show is often said to have. We really started off with something of an anything goes philosophy, or at least try anything. When I started, Penn and Duncan had a million ideas and concepts for the world to explore. They were so gracious and willing to give over a lot of control to the artists when it came to shaping the stories and journey of Clancy. The show leaned heavily into the apocalyptic feel, making letting go an important element. Every episode ended with a world dying, and it was up to Duncan, Pendleton, and the writer's room to come up with these dying worlds. That was a lot, huh? And there were still a lot of things I left out about the production philosophy that guided the show. I only wanted to give you guys a little taste so it would spark your curiosity enough to do your own research. It's such a tragedy that the Midnight Gospel was cancelled because I really wanted to know more about the world of Chromatic Ribbon. I wanted to know all about Clancy's new adventures. What did it mean when he boarded the bus and saw all the people from the dead worlds there? Did he ever make up with his sister? And what happened to the guy who was obsessed with ice cream and his dad? This is really one of the tragedies of cancelled shows. It leaves you with so many questions and no one you can go to for answers. That being said, you've seen the title of the video. Now let me tell you all about the episodes I enjoyed the most and what I gleaned the most wisdom from. Now, a quick disclaimer. These are my personal opinions and interpretations of the show's lesson, and me choosing the episodes does not mean I thought poorly of the other ones. Duncan is a wonderful interviewer, and every guest was insightful and valuable in their own right. I'm only choosing the ones that speak the most to my experience, okay? Okay. Starting off with episode 4 with Trudy Goodman. After Clancy mistakenly lands on a demonic planet, he meets Trudy, voiced by Trudy Goodman, the love barbarian. Thus begins a conversation about love, forgiveness, community building, and mindfulness. Now, as I was rewatching this episode, I had actually forgotten a lot about what she said in it. You do need support to forgive people who wronged you, and it's not something you can just do by yourself. And that was something that was very hard for me to admit. Even now, I would get these flare-ups where I thought about how someone wronged me, and if I would ever be able to let that go. We're not going to love our enemy, but we don't have to be obsessed for a lifetime with the harm that's been done to us. The episode tells you straight up that forgiveness is not easy. It's the ultimate spiritual pull-up bar, and I'm so tired of people who don't understand that, telling you to just forgive the people who wronged you. And most importantly, turning that forgiveness on yourself. Because I know a lot of people would let stuff slide, but when they make a mistake, it's suddenly the end of the world, me included. Forgiving yourself for how you may have treated someone when you are stressed out or when you made a costly mistake seems like a monumental task, but that's why it's not easy. Nothing good comes easy, and anyone who tells you that is a liar and a fraud. When talking about community building, she says when you're lonely, starting a place can be a good idea. I of course agree. That's why I started this channel. It's my sonar. I wanted to find people who have a similar vibe. When I first came here, I didn't know anybody. I started my first sitting group with 2 people, Fred and Steve. The visuals of the episode are equally stunning and tell a story of their own. In this episode, the guest, Trudy, has been reimagined as this fearless barbarian who fights with the power of love and forgiveness. Clancy follows her along on her quest to resurrect her boyfriend who has been killed by a bud demon, Prince Jamroll. I said what I said. The episode, of course, ends with another apocalypse caused by the bud demon, mind you, leaving Clancy to return with Trudy's rose and another pair of shoes. I didn't know where to put this, so I'll put this here. But I love that the souvenirs for each world is something strange and a pair of shoes. Intentional or not, it's a callback to the adage to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, which Clancy does each episode and which Duncan does every time he interviews a guest. The next episode is episode 5 with Jason Lowe. Clancy ends up in his computer's soul prison for wayward beings, which is actually as crazy as it sounds, where he interviews one of the prisoner's soul bird or psychopomp. A psychopomp is basically a guide. Think Virgil from Dante's Inferno or Beatrice from Over the Garden Wall. Moving on. This episode discussed a lot of Buddhist concepts like the Bardo loop, Indra's net, but mostly the episode talks about how attachment to the self brings suffering. Now, these concepts are already things I'm familiar with because I practice them a lot in my own life. Take that as you will. And so the concept that impermanence brings suffering leads itself to Stoic philosophy, which can essentially be boiled down to change what you can and don't worry about what you can't. Again, this is very, very bare bones, but you have to remember that Stoicism has been commodified by the self-help industry to the point where it's lost track of its original meaning as a result. People are not really treating detachment as detachment for its own sake, but to get something. You'll see video topics like detachment in dating, detachment in your work, etc. But that's not really detaching yourself now, is it? Buddhist teachings aside, I wanted to talk about the visuals of the episode because for me, that's where a lot of the wisdom came from. It's a time loop. Every time Bob, the prisoner, tried to escape the prison, they would die in a horrible, horrible way, which would start them at the beginning of their prison break attempt. But with every loop, Bob would do things differently until they finally learned the lesson they needed to escape. I counted and Bob died 7 times before they understood the lesson being taught to them and their current situation. My interpretation of this is how the universe is always throwing the same lesson at you over and over again until you learn what it's trying to say. It's almost like deja vu. You swear you've been in this exact scenario before, and that's because you have. The universe has thrown this your way to check if you've learned your lesson from last time. Of particular note is Bob's heart. When it's first plucked out by the gods, you can see it's a snarling beast with barbs and stitches protruding from it. This is your anger, your confusion, your frustration at the first time you encounter a lesson from the universe. As the loop goes on, you can see it smoothing out until it reaches its highest form. The visuals of the Bardo loop are stunningly animated and they evoke everything from anger to the feelings of trying, being caught in your own trap, and finally, relief. The animation accompanying the episode is why I liked it so much. Before I talk about my favorite episode from the Midnight Gospel, I just want to give an honorable mention to episode 2 with Annie Lamott as the dear dog. You are more than your flaws, more than your mental illnesses, more than your addictions, and more than your past. Those things don't have to define you or your work. And while you can channel those experiences into your work, the art you create is not good solely because you're suffering for it. Art that you've poured love into is not less than art that you've bled for. There is meaning in both, so why choose only one? Episode 8 with Deneen Fendig, also known as Duncan's mom. This is my favorite episode and it's quite fitting that it's the season finale and the longest episode. Unfortunately, Deneen passed in 2013, but she has been immortalized by her son's podcast and people will be able to hear her wise words for a long time. From the get-go, you can tell they both have immense fondness for one another. Their rapport made me emotional just listening to it. She sounds like such a sweet person. They talk a bit about how Duncan's birth went before moving into topics like mindfulness, meditation, and parenting. According to the episode, Deneen was a psychologist for many years who then retired, and she talked about how those formative years are important to children. Which brings me to the matter of parentification and how the first child, who is usually just a baby themselves, is required to now act older than they are and required to be more responsible than they understand. All of a sudden, they're required to be something they aren't, and it changes them forever. You're supposed to act like you're not a baby because there is now a much younger baby present, and all of a sudden you're thrust into the role of a helper for your parents when you're really just a child yourself. The positive reinforcement that comes with parentifying a child contributes to the compulsive responsibility many people end up having as adults. They carry everything on their shoulders to the point where there is a perceived nonchalance on everyone else's part, and that's because these things were reinforced in their formative years. But that's not all that's discussed in the episode. There's also the transformative nature of tragedies, and sometimes there's nothing you can do to stop the heartbreak but cry. I do remember the first time I heard Deneen say, "You cry," in response to Duncan asking what to do when you just can't stop the heartbreak. I was watching the show by myself in a corner of the room I shared with my sister. No one else wanted to watch with me, and at the time I was quite salty about that. But now I'm glad I experienced it alone. And I did cry. It felt like I had been given permission to release all the emotions I had been feeling about the way my life was going. And in the most intense scene, the episode goes on to talk about the alchemical transfiguration of ego death and what happens when you open your heart, like truly open your heart with no expectations of how things will turn out. The visuals paired with this episode were my favorite. Soft pastel colors and an army of teddy bear doctors helping us witness the miracle of life and death, birth and age. There's even a reference to the Harry Harlow affection experiment. I've watched this episode many times. It's a true treasure, and I recommend you watch it and then listen to the podcast. My final thoughts aren't anything new, but I do want to say I enjoyed scripting this as much as I enjoyed the show. Maybe now you understand why this show is so special to me and why I'm upset Netflix cancelled it. I want to thank everyone who watched to the end, and more importantly, I want to thank all my loved ones and Inka who are probably watching right now. As said in episode 8, love is supportive, holds us, and has a quality of benevolence that we might have never known exists. And with that, I'm going to end the video. If you'd like to watch my previous video about another trippy animation I'm a big fan of, you can click up here. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and stay tuned for more videos from me.